down. And right now, the most accurate source in news, Julian Assange. Welcome back to the show, Julian.
G'day, Randy.
It's great to have you back on. You know, we did that 10-week series, Assange Countdown to Freedom. I got so into it that it was difficult to follow that series. So I slowly stepped away. I really didn't, because we put on Scott Ludlam, the ex-senator from Western Australia, who was on a technicality bumped out of there. Julian, I just want to make just a couple of observations first, and that is this woman called me last night. Her name is Laura Krauss. She's a sister of Alison Krauss, who was the one of the four that were killed on May 4th, 1970 at Kent State. And
murdered in cold blood, shall we say.
Right, murdered in cold blood by the National Guard. That's Dennis Bernstein. We'll get to you in a second. All right, so she said that WikiLeaks, and she really thanked God and had a lot of gratitude for WikiLeaks preserving and getting some very, very important documents. And I just thought I'd convey that to you. Are you aware of that?
I am aware, even as an Australian, this important part of U.S. history. But no, we didn't. Interestingly, we didn't intend, if you like, to specifically publish Kent State documents. It's part of one of our big archives of cable documents called the Kissinger cables from the 1970s. But we know that when you take the internal communications of the State Department or another major powerful organization, that it tends to touch on nearly everything. And the public's ability to spot connections in your material that are relevant at the time that you publish it and after, or in this case even before, greatly outstrips your own, that the public intelligence is much greater. And so I'm always filled with extreme irritation with those journalists who sit upon hoards of national historical treasure. You know, how our human institutions in a variety of countries have actually behaved, because the public's ability to understand it and connect it to their own personal histories, take it and use it in litigation, use it in political campaigns, is much greater than the rather narrow and relatively provincial character of any particular journalist or editor, including me.
All right. I now want to introduce Dennis Bernstein, who's coming from KPFA. Dennis?
Thank you, Julian Assange. Terrific to meet you on the phone. I got all the dope on you from the best source, which is your mom, who we spoke to a couple of weeks ago, and she was crucial and strong. It's good to meet you here on the phone. By the way, I just got off the line with Oliver Stone, who was being shredded everywhere because he had the temerity and the nerve to do a series of interviews with Putin, and all the idiot journalists in the corporate media of the United States are falling over each other to show how tough they are by putting down Oliver Stone. By the way, what do you think of those? Have you had a chance to hear any of that stuff?
I did see all four. I think they're very interesting. I mean, you can split them up into the first three and the last one, because the last one happens after the US elections. So it takes place within the context of this neo-McCarthyist Russian hysteria. And so it's a bit more combative. Also, I guess it's the last in the series, and so therefore Stone doesn't have to play so nice to make sure he gets the next episode. But I think in terms of the aesthetics are quite interesting. He uses 4 or 5 shaky cameras, which I like. But it's just, Putin is a consummate politician for Russia, a little less consummate when dealing with the rest of the world, but still pretty skilled. But you can't hide completely who you are over the course of 4 hours. So lots of little interesting things come out.
Like, name one. Curious.
Well, I'll give you an example. It has been remarked upon, but not many people have seen it. So not many people have detected it. I think it's in the last or second last episode. Oliver Stone is showing Vladimir Putin Dr. Strangelove, yes, which Putin says he hasn't seen before, which is actually quite possible. And Dr. Strangelove is one of my favorite movies. I think it's Stanley Kubrick, I think, at his best, actually, in terms of aesthetics plus deep political insights into, in that case, nuclear war. So Putin is completely unmoving during the whole thing. And you can understand why. As a Russian leader, he needs to not display weakness at any point in time. And I assume that Kubrick movie is, from Putin's point of view, he doesn't know, if he genuinely doesn't know what the movie is, he doesn't know how it's going to end. And so therefore anything that he does partway through, any smiling, for example, or laughing at a particular scene, he doesn't know how that character or that scene's going to pan out. And so he has to keep himself kind of resolute to being affected by the film. And at the end of the film, he says, well, that's interesting. They even predicted some of the technical issues, and actually not much has changed in the basic dynamics, which is, basic mad dynamics. And he's fiddling with a DVD case of the film. And Oliver Stone gives him the case, and he walks out the door to say goodbye to go into another chamber of the Kremlin. And then he comes back with a little, very subtle smirk on his face, with the CD case open and presented to Stone in the camera, rotating it around a bit, and you can see that it's empty. And he says, well, typical American gift.
That's what we have at WBAA, by the way. We have typical gifts. That's going to be our premium tonight. A nice documentary by Oliver Stone with an empty inside.
We'll give the case an empty inside. Typical American gift.
$60.
But here's the twist. That's what quite a lot of people remarked on that. It is actually pretty funny. And from the Russian perspective, actually, in the post-90s, they made many of these overtures. You could say they're in a forced position, but they did. And then they felt the US didn't live up to its side of the bargain. So empty gift box.
Empty promises from the Americas.
Exactly. If you look very closely, you'll see that when Putin is fiddling with the DVD case, while he's talking about the movie, while it's on the table, before Oliver Stone has given it to him, he cracks it open just a little bit and peers inside for half a second, not even, a quarter of a second, and closes it again. So actually, he knows when Putin has given it to him, when Oliver Stone has given it to him, that it's empty. And so then he's clearly thinking about the political dynamics of this gag as he's going into the other room. Because what's the other interpretation? The other interpretation is Putin is such a neurotic paranoid that when Oliver Stone gives him a DVD case, the first thing he does is not like give it to some assistant, go off and do useful work. He neurotically opens it and checks it to see, is there really a DVD in there, or maybe a bug or something else.
That's what I do these days. Hey, by the way, did you see the other, I think Kubrick's first movie, anti-war film called Paths of Glory?
Yes. He took it over from another director who didn't finish it. I can't remember if he died or what the story was, but he took it over.
What is your analysis of that film?
Paths of Glory.
Yes.
It's a long time since I've seen it. So
okay.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows the movie. There's a great scene at the end. All right, so let's get away. I'm just getting away from Putin here for just a minute because I know you're on short time today. You still have, it's amazing the sense of humor you have. Everybody that I know who has visited you says that Julian Assange has such a great sense of humor. If you follow your Twitter feed, there's this guy, this charlatan journalist by the name of Kurt Eichenwald. And I got to tell you something. You have made mincemeat out of this guy. The other day, the guy 50 tweets about you. What was that all about?
Yeah, it's a bit strange. He's a Newsweek reporter, pro-Clinton, pro-CIA, at least in the last year. I don't know about him before then. He wasn't on my radar. And he produced the single most spread piece of fake news during the 2016 election. It was a Newsweek article. And it claimed that WikiLeaks was publishing fabricated documents, and that we were in a conspiracy with Sputnik, which is a Russian thing like RT, a Russian government controlled or owned news outlet, and the Trump campaign. And you can look up exactly what the story is, but basically we published an email that Sidney Blumenthal had forwarded that was one of his articles, and the Sputnik guy, who was this young reporter in DC, had interpreted the quote as coming from Sidney Blumenthal, who was Hillary Clinton's assistant, not Kurt Eichenwald, right, who the quote it actually was.
Yes.
And that's very easy to do if you look at the email, because it's like a forwards within forwards and so on. And apparently he took it down within 20 minutes. But anyway, Eichenwald then span this story about how this was an elaborate plot. And this is proof, the first big proof of this elaborate conspiracy. Anyway, that young guy, Sputnik fired him.
Moran.
Yeah, right? Bill Moran. Who's in D.C. Sputnik fired him. And, you know, he was just moving too quickly. He did make a mistake, which is his fault, but understandable one. So then he sued Newsweek. He happened to be a Georgetown University a law school graduate, and now he had no job, so he went and did his bar admission to the DC bar, I guess, and proceeded to sue Newsweek, and was successful. Filed a complaint in court. That moved along. Newsweek settled out of court and took down the two articles, and I believe made some financial compensation. The terms are not public. And then this guy, Eichenwald, has Newsweek removed from his biography on his Twitter page, on his bio. So perhaps they've also fired him as well. Anyway, so it seems that's the cause of this insane ranting, but it's a pretty creepy, nasty guy, actually.
A very scary guy. Very scary.
Wasn't on my radar before, but actually has done some pretty creepy things.
You can check them all out.
Had paid some 14-year-olds thousands of dollars to set up a child pornography website, or reactivate a child pornography website, and says it's part of his investigative journalism for the New York Times. He ended up having to leave the Times. That was in about 2006, 2007. But he's done quite a lot of these slimy things. So anyway, coming out of that case, I discovered that he had a pseudonym. I can't remember the surname now. First name Andrew. And so then I saw that on his Amazon page for his books, actually the same pseudonym that he's used to make these credit card purchases of child porn, which he says are for this story, have been reviewing his books. And so he has a glowing hagiographic reviews of his books. Now, I imagine quite a lot of authors do that, so I don't think that's something to, it's a bit duplicitous, but it's not something to complain about too much. But actually, if you look at the particular writing, this is someone who really kind of gets off on fraud, basically. He kind of gets off on lying and making fabrications. He seems to have done it in a really serious way in another case, which I won't speak about yet, but I think we might later on. I mean, normally we wouldn't deal with it, but actually it might put someone in, left to its own devices, it will put a young man in prison for maybe a decade. So we might look into that.
All right. Dennis?
Go ahead, Dennis, jump in. Yes. Jump in here. Julian, I'd love to turn your attention to some of the news breaking around your struggle. I know that you've introduced material, your legal crew has taken your case to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. I believe that was filed today or is being filed this week. Could you talk about what's going on there? Why are you going to that court, and what's the significance of that?
Well, it's really significant, not so much for me, but for the whole refugee law situation across the world. I'm very proud of, in some way, of having triggered it. It's Ecuador who's formally gone to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. That's like the human rights court that emerges from the OAS, covers all of the Americas. Most of the countries directly obey its ruling. The US sees them only as advisory, but they still have a very significant intellectual influence, even within the United States and then across the world. It's one of the, I suppose, most well-regarded international legal bodies. The other would be the European Court on Human Rights and perhaps the UN Human Rights Commission. Okay, so I've out of my situation, the legal issues that were kind of everyone started talking about in my situation, Ecuador has the view, which is clearly backed up by the Inter-American Court, that there's several refugee issues have developed and need a proper hearing, particularly insofar as it concerns what are the obligations on states to assess someone as being a refugee or not and protect them domestically and internationally. And then how should refugees be assessed and processed out of the domestic territory? So out of in the case of the US, the continental United States. How should they be processed? For example, in embassies, UN compounds, warships, transit lounges, etc. And that bears pretty directly on my situation, but it also has a strong bearing on the situation in Syria, and all situations where you have refugees fleeing from the circumstance of persecution into neighboring countries, taking long, dangerous treks across the desert, across the sea, drowning in the Mediterranean, etc. So if you can process these refugees very close to their origin, you save lives, and you also stop social disorder coming about. So if it's sort of standardized how you process them at embassies, they can be processed in the embassies in Syria, for example, or in the U.S. embassy in Jordan or Lebanon. So it's really significant. I think it's the most significant consideration of refugee law since 1969, when the optional protocol on the 1951 convention, which is the biggest convention that encompasses refugees, was signed by many countries at the UN. So there was an attempt in 1975 also at the UN to consider this issue, interestingly brought about by Australia, because in the early 70s you had lots of refugees in South Vietnam fleeing the anti-communists or Western-associated Vietnamese were fleeing, and a lot of those were coming down through the Indonesian archipelago, many dying at sea, trying to get to Australia. So Australia wanted to standardize or normalize processing of refugees in the embassies it had in those countries that were on the way, embassies and other compounds, on the way to Australia. And at that time, in 75, the Soviet Union and the United States blocked it. There wasn't enough countries to kind of get a consensus on this. There is a consensus already in most of Latin America, but to extend that consensus elsewhere. Since that time, human rights law has really developed in earnest as a proper legal field that creates various obligations on states not to arbitrarily detain people and so on. A lot of this coming from some good things that emerged from the Cold War, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political rights. And in that, there's aspects that have to do with arbitrary detention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so on. But basically, a lot of these human rights instruments, when properly executed, force you to protect people, force the state to protect people, or at the very least gives the state a right to protect people. And that then, in effect, has a state take a refugee. It's the same action. If you have to protect people that are being persecuted, who are under various threats, according to International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and other human rights law, then what you're doing is basically you're taking in a refugee and protecting them as a refugee. So there's been a coming together of the 1951 Convention on Refugees, 1967 Protocol, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, other regional human rights instruments, together with what one has to do under refugee law. So it's an interlocking system of different obligations that states should hold. And in order to be consistent with these obligations, things should be done a certain way, and for there not to be conflict. So the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has seen this, and Ecuador is being great in deciding it's going to take this case to deal with this question about how refugees should be dealt with. And then there's been 54 amicus curiae from the UNHCR, which is the big UN body that processes refugees, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Mexico, 6 other Latin American states, a lot of legal clinics, Georgetown, and so on. So, yeah, and I helped write an amicus, Balthazar goes on, and Stella Morris, and a bunch of our other legal team, which I'm quite proud of, to have contributed to this really quite, potentially groundbreaking thing. We'll see what the commission, we'll see what the Inter-American Court says, but it is definitely going to issue an opinion. It's not a matter of winning a case or losing a case. There's no case. What there is, the commission has decided this is a very important area of law. The Inter-American Court on Human Rights has decided that this is a very important area of law, and they're going to consider it. They're going to have a hearing in August, and they're going to issue an opinion. And I think this will be the single most important document trying to harmonize refugee law that will be, very intellectually influential at an international level. So it's good that something is emerging out of my situation other than just perhaps my freedom.
It won't just affect you; it would be precedent and affect other refugees in a similar situation.
And what kind of remedy? What kinds of remedies could come out of this in terms of the treatment of refugees? What would be the hope there?
Well, I think Stella Morris, one of my lawyers, is about to speak, so I'll defer that question to her. But look, there's a lot of talk in the United States about the Trump administration's shutting down of migrants or tourists coming from some Muslim countries in the Middle East. That's strange that there's so much talk about that, and not something which I think is a much more serious situation, which was the shutting down of all refugee applications for 180 days. That's a really serious situation. Now, I do understand, okay, there were certain election promises that were made. It's probably reasonable to want to tweak the refugee processing thing, etc. But it's not reasonable to be accepting tourists from all over the world, but not be accepting refugees all over the world. If you want to say that, okay, Syria is a very dangerous country to be accepting refugees from, you have to kind of reboot your refugee processing system, and you need a bit of time to do that, fine. But really, what about refugees from New Zealand, or refugees from Mexico, or refugees from Colombia? Are these likely to be ISIS people? Absolutely not. And if you're taking tourists from those same countries, it's completely absurd to block refugee processing. So this movement from the Inter-American Court might, at least intellectually, perhaps a little bit culturally, in the legal culture, be a movement in the other direction. I think that's an important movement in the other direction.
All right. We'll be talking to Stella Morris, one of your many lawyers. You have a great legal team there on every front. I just, we're going to let you go here in a minute. And I wanted to just ask you about just a few things here. First of all, about WBAI. WBAI, WikiLeaks has been able to survive on not listeners, but by your supporters, not by corporate grants, by ads. What is your thoughts about WBAI and the Pacifica Network, Julian?
Well, look at this show and other shows like the Off the Hook and so on that WBAI has run, or actually, in fact, it's long history going back to the George Carlin and the 730 Words. What makes WBAI and Pacifica different? That it can do that, and it seems that other radio stations can't. Well, I have WikiLeaks perspective. We're in a kind of similar situation. Actually, we can't be squeezed because we are funded by our readers. We're not funded by another big industrial group that owns us, like Amazon. We're not funded by a giant philanthropist who contributes 40% of our budget. No one contributes more than 1% of WikiLeaks' entire budget. And what does that mean? That means that we can annoy any particular group of our readers just as long as we don't annoy all of them at once for months and months. And WBAI is in exactly the same situation. That because it is listener funded, it doesn't have to kowtow to advertising and the big firms that would be advertising, and it doesn't have to kowtow to George Soros or the Rockefellers or one of these other
Ford
big
Foundation.
foundations that always have their interests and are usually rather scared of certain types of controversy.
Yes. But that, as you said earlier, we spoke earlier about that gives us a market out there. There's a market out there that would like to have something like the series that we ran on you, because nobody else is serving a series like that here.
Well, I think this is WBAI and Pacifica's comparative advantage, and every institution has to work, and even person has to work within their comparative advantage. What can they do? What can WBAI do through its structure that others cannot do that is worth doing? That's really the big question, right? And what an immense comparative. WBAI has lots of problems, just like WikiLeaks does. If you're constantly having to appeal to your readers and so on, you've got to be popular in a certain way. That's a constraint. So, and to not be careful about what sort of relationships it's entering into, so it doesn't end up being squeezed. Okay, so that's comparative disadvantage. But the comparative advantage is enormous, which is being able to produce shows like this one and many other ones, which are controversial and which would normally see blowback, political blowback, that would shut down advertisers and shut down conservative conservative foundational funders. That is WBAI's comparative advantage. So that means that there's a section of that means amongst listeners, there must be, I'm sure there is, I'm sure that's why WBAI has survived, people who are not hearing something from others. They're not hearing those things which are hard to say, because they're hard for other types of institutions to say them, because there's a different structural constraint on these other types of institutions. And that structural constraint, there might be other constraints, but that structural constraint doesn't exist for WBAI. So that is WBAI's comparative advantage, and that's what I think it should go for. It should go for the hardest, most difficult programs where that information or those voices are denied to the audience because there's a restriction in supply of that hopefully true information or viewpoints. So I know WBI has had difficulties over the years in terms of finances. Actually, it's quite amazing that with this whole internet transition that it's doing so well. But I think it should really embrace that comparative advantage of doing things that others cannot do.
Julian Assange, we're talking about Julian Assange. Dennis, do you have one last quick question? Because we have to get Stella Morse, his attorney, on, and we have Barrett Brown, and we have fundraising to do. I thank you, Julian, for staying on as long as you have. Dennis, why don't you get one last quick question in there, and we'll bring on the...
All right. I don't know if this is quick, but maybe it's a naive question, but would you characterize or consider...
Well, Dennis, you know what they say. Better to be naive and do something because the realists have left the world in the situation that it is.
Well, thank you. So I will just stumble towards the truth here if I can and ask you if you consider the DNC flow out of the information flow out of the DNC a hack or a leak?
Well, that's interesting. This is a sourcing question. So there's lots of different alleged flows actually out of the DNC over a 2-year period. If you read rather closely, seemingly by maybe 5 different actors of different kinds, state actors, domestic actors, it's not entirely clear. These are statements coming out of U.S. intelligence. If you read closely, actually I haven't seen those repeated in 2007, but they were earlier on in 2016. So we don't talk about sourcing in that way. What we talk about is our publications, and that they're completely accurate, and that our publications did not come from a state actor. We haven't said anything else about them, and we probably won't say anything else about them. We have to see how things develop, but probably we won't say anything else but that. Because if we start fleshing in more details, it makes it easier to catch our sources, which we obviously don't want.
All right, I wasn't going to ask you that question, but I wanted to ask you this one, Julian. We'll let you get off on this one, get out with this one, and that is a lot of the letters that you get. You were talking to me the other day about one contribution from somebody in a prison. Can you tell us about that, and then we'll move on here.
Okay, Randy, this is the last question. You're sneaky. Well, I would, in some ways, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know whether I can name the guy, so I'm not going to. He probably does deserve to be named. But I get quite a lot of letters from prisoners. I don't know why they're writing to me. I've been detained in one form or another without charge for 7 years, including in violation of 2 UN rulings. So I don't know why they're looking for me for legal advice. But one letter particularly sticks in my mind. It was from the United States. So a 22-year-old man. He'd been sentenced to 55 years in prison. And you think, when I in fact read the letter, I thought, 55 years, okay, he's a murderer of some kind. No. He's a young punk, and police were picking on him, and maybe he was a robber as well, I don't know. But yeah, he's been chased by the cops downtown, and so chasing him, he pointed towards them and he fired a shot, and it missed the cop. That's it. I checked out the case with the records, with what was in the newspaper. His description is completely accurate. That's it. In prison for 55 years, attempted murder of a cop. unlawful possession of firearm, firing a firearm within city limits, etc. 65 years.
Wow. 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 And he made a $10 contribution as well to WikiLeaks, I believe.
Yeah, and I was astounded because I opened a letter and there was a check to me from the Department of Justice.
Right.
And given this enormous grand jury proceeding that they're trying to, trying to prosecute me and potentially my staff with espionage and a whole lot of other things relating to our releases on the Iraq-Afghan war and so on. I thought this was quite interesting to see that this institution that's trying to prosecute me was sending me a check. But it turned out it was this prisoner had sent me $10.
Wow.
And the prisoners, they can't access normal bank accounts, so the DOJ has little accounts for them, and they put their money in the DOJ account. So when they want to send money somewhere, it comes from the DOJ.
That's what I might call a bad check.
All right. Listen, I'm sorry I snuck
I looked quite a lot into his case.
Yeah.
It seems like he has no appeal opportunities.
Wow.
From what I can determine, unless there's amnesty or some significant changing of the law.
I'm going to look into that case here.
We're out of luck.
I'm going to look into that case right here. We are going to let you go. Finally, we kept you overtime here, and I appreciate your sharing these thoughts and being part of this. You help us a lot. My ratings here are better than ever, and I appreciate you being on the show, and I appreciate WikiLeaks promoting WBAI and supporting WBAI, and we'll hopefully talk to you very soon, and we'll be talking to your lawyer to get into the details of this case before the Inter-American Court right after. Thank you very much, Julian. We're going to say goodbye.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you.
Thanks. Free speech outfits have to look out for each other, otherwise they won't be free.
Keep that phone. Don't hang up, all right? We'll be back with your attorney in just 1 minute. We're talking Stella Morris. Stella Morris. All right, that's Neil Young and Ohio. I'm Randy Credico here at WBAI, joined by Dennis Bernstein from KPFA in Berkeley. This is 99.5 FM. So we've identified where we are, and well, that was a great interview. Really, what a great interview that was. Dennis, all right, first we're going to go to. We talked about his Julian's case right now. We just spoke to him about the case before the Inter-American Court. We're being joined by one of his many superstar attorneys, Stella Morris. Stella, welcome to Live on the Fly.
Hi, Randy. Hi, Dennis.
Hello.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So I've got like a stack of papers here that I downloaded today that were sent to me, and all of these amicus briefs. And I got to tell you, it's as thick as War and Peace on acid. So I'm not an attorney. Can you just tell us exactly when is this going before the Inter-American Court? And just tell us first, what is the Inter-American Court as opposed to the Organization of American States? Is it part of it?
Well, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights is one of the organs that come out of the OAS. There's also the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And the Inter-American Court considers both cases and issues advisory opinions. So in this case, it will issue an advisory opinion which will address some of the legal difficulties that have come about as a result of the standoff between the UK and Ecuador when Ecuador issued asylum to Julian Assange in 2012.
So Ecuador initially filed this with the OAS or the Inter-American Court. So that was filed. And this is to get not an opinion, but to get a determination? It requested an advisory opinion back in 2016, and then the court opened up
the process to consultation. And the response has been really spectacular. As Julian covered a lot of ground, actually. 55 amicus briefs, so briefs written by NGOs, legal academics, member states, expressing their opinion on the questions before the court. And one of my colleagues, Baltasar Garzón,